It's Pride Month. Hallelujah! The time of year for powerful corporations to make a unique kind of profit, pledging their support to queer people, and by the way, I'm using queer as an umbrella term, affirming our identities through Twitter posts, funny little rainbow redesigns of products, big silly booths at pride parades nationwide, yada yada, you know the drill. It was through these little identity affirmations which I became aware that Don't Nod, the French video game studio that produced Life is Strange 1 and 2, which I will absolutely be covering more about in a later video, had placed the recent game Tell Me Why on Steam for free throughout June. This was a game I had been meaning to play for a while. One of their lead characters is transgender. This had piqued my interest, but I didn't really get why it had at its time of release in 2020. Unfortunately, the game was only for Xbox, and who has one of those? I've never met them. The last time I saw an Xbox, it was my own. It had red-ringed itself into oblivion sometime in 2015, probably because of the sheer number of times I forced it to play Halo 2 and Mass Effect. I mourned for it. Yet here was Tell Me Why, back in my life, available for my PC, and more to the point, free. That's real pride right there. That's commitment to the cause, folks. I thought about it again. Hey, that one guy in it is transgender, and me, I'm transgender. I should play it. And I did. And here is a full transcript of possibly every thought which went through my head while playing it. Okay, well, first off, a lot of the thoughts which went through my head were, I have to pee, because I kept drinking tea while playing, and that stuff goes right through me. Tell Me Why, like Life is Strange, is episodic. It is 3, I think generally long enough episodes, although I feel the pacing was a bit wonky. I have no idea how long this game is in total because I kept pausing it to do other things. At one point I talked on the phone for a while, another time my cat screamed at me passionately to play with his kind of gross mouse toy. But all in all, I feel like this game suited its length. Another thing I kept thinking was, why is this not a Life is Strange title? And honestly, after doing the barest minimum of research, it seems like a fairly complicated answer involving Square Enix, ownership rights, and Deck 9, the American and less good production studio which now develops the Life is Strange franchise. When I delve into those first 2 Life is Stranges later, I'll talk more about how they play and the kind of tone in which they take, but just know that Tell Me Why plays in a very similar way to each of them. It even has references to them in a couple of cute little ways.
Hey, you remember the ad for this? What was their slogan again?
Something poetic about time travel and life being weird, I think.
Tell Me Why focuses on the relationship between its 2 protagonists, the Ronan twins, Allison and Tyler. The 2 live in rural Alaska, and the setting was beautiful and atmospheric like Don't Nod games are known to be, and also reminded me how much I love to be in a warm climate and that I can only stand snow for maybe 2 days max. The story begins in what appears to be one of those rooms where a cop grills you for information, and there is a child sitting at the table who sort of melodramatically reveals that they have killed their mother.
I killed my mother.
The player controls Allison or Tyler at various points in order to progress the story from both of their perspectives, and we begin to learn about them through the first places we meet them, their rooms. We can see some of Allison's hobbies, interests, and know how excited she is to be seeing Tyler. For Tyler, we learn that he's been at this place for a long time and that it's kind of like a juvenile detention center, that he seems happy to be leaving but in a bittersweet way. This place was clearly important to him and he isn't desperate to be moving on from it. The game is also upfront quickly about Tyler being a transgender man. You can see his testosterone schedule, some of the educational books he's been reading about transgender people, and he will make some comments to himself about it as well. I found that refreshing. His transness doesn't play a background role, but more so one of his everyday. His transness is given both respect and normality. Even his voice actor, August Aiden Black, is transgender, which is very cool. Allison and Tyler meet outside of the detention center, and it's for sure an awkward, oh wow, we used to be really close but haven't seen each other in ages kind of thing. But it's also a bit odd. There are no characters who we see send Tyler off, and he isn't the most social of guys, but he expressly states his fondness for several off-screen characters that informed his experiences while at the detention center. So it's just sort of odd that none are around to say goodbye to him. This will happen kind of a number of times throughout the game. Though the primary cast of characters are interesting, generally well-developed people, the town, and by extension the game, can sometimes feel eerily empty. Perhaps this was intentional and meant to align with the intense relationship which the twins share, a sometimes us against the world kind of thing, but it's certainly curious. Anyway, the twins take a ferry ride across the bay to their hometown, Delos Crossing.
I'm sorry, I'm just trying to wrap my head around the fact that you're right here, standing beside me, on our way to Delos.
You don't have to apologize. It's a lot.
Allison still lives there, and Tyler certainly feels weird about returning to it after nearly 10 years. The player can also take this time to learn a bit more about Alaska itself if they don't know very much. We can see that there are a lot of snow and mountains, that there is a continuous debate over gun control, hunting and natural preservation, and conflict between the left and the right. The player can also ride this entire ferry in real time if they are me and didn't know they could skip to docking. But I suppose it was a scenic ride, so it's fine, I guess. Allison will give Tyler a peace offering from her adoptive father, Eddie Brown. It's a ring which Eddie carved, and as Allison mentions, the act of gift giving holds considerable significance in Eddie's Tlingit culture. That's another cool thing about this game. It has several native Alaskan characters and provides some unique insight and education about Tlingit and Haida culture and clan living. Eddie is the chief of police and also the one who put Tyler into the criminal justice system, which would of course convict him of murder, imprison him in juvie, separate him from Allison, and burden him with a lifelong criminal record at the age of 11. Despite their history, Allison has grown to love Eddie as a father and wants a reconciliation of family. Tyler is naturally a bit conflicted over it all. This is where the player can begin to play out how the relationship between the twins will grow or weaken throughout the game, despite how close they were in childhood. I think its complexity is really fascinating. When presented with choices or dialogue options which might express a level of emotional maturity, that is, recognizing that everyone is complicated, capable of change, and often suffering in their own quiet ways, the path of forgiveness or moving past shame and pride to express love will often begin to heal the relationship between the twins and strengthen their bond. To withhold forgiveness, as there is certainly a strength in refusing a relationship with those that have hurt you, may still saddle the player with consequence. But it isn't overtly negative consequence either. It is the recognition that sometimes people just change, even those you were close to, and that you can both move on and find new direction. Sometimes differences are actually irreconcilable. But that's not always a bad thing. Recognizing that is also a form of emotional maturity. Personally, I found the most satisfaction in forgiveness and being more open, and the game played out for me accordingly. So I chose to accept the ring, and I think Tyler sums it up pretty well. It's a start. I think he does it largely to show his sister that he loves her, even if he doesn't particularly want or need a close relationship with her adoptive father. The game progresses in many similar ways to Life is Strange, talking with people, being a walking simulator, detailed settings, atmospheric music. The twins return to their old house, which has stood essentially the same since they left it a decade ago. As they move throughout the house, totally weirded out by how it has preserved their childhood and how they as adults are so wildly different, they have to come to terms with what to do with the house, and that selling it is probably the best option. We can see that they were living in poverty and that their relationship with their mother Marianne was complicated and hard for them to understand as children. Allison holds a lot of anger and resentment about her mother, and Tyler believes that Marianne attacked him the night of her death because he had cut his hair, and she couldn't deal with him being transgender, something which, though he did not have the language for as a child, he knew himself to be, a boy, Allison's twin brother.
Handmade soap. Still here after 10 years. Impressive.
You could say that about the entire house.
Wow. I forgot all about her weird concoctions.
And how she was always testing them on us. Like we were...
There were so many times I looked in this mirror hoping somehow it'd show me something different.
And damn, can I just say go Tyler? Kid knew he was a boy pretty early on and stuck to his guns like an absolute champ, starting his transition immediately at the age of 18. And while that is certainly a thing which some transgender people experience, it can also take a lot longer for other folks to realize. For example, it took me 27 years just to realize I was trans. You'd think something like being unable to recognize myself in photos and having an intense aversion to them altogether would have made me realize something even a little sooner, but nope, I'm just a bit stupid. Anyway, like Life is Strange, a somewhat sudden supernatural mechanic is revealed in Tell Me Why. Together, the twins have the ability to communicate telepathically with something they call the voice, and that they can recreate shared memories together and see where they happened. The power is pretty cool, and while I think it's kind of dumb and overplayed that they have to be twins to have this power, Don't Nod's games are complicated enough for it to play also a somewhat allegorical role, representing intense codependency derived from shared trauma. Remembering how to use this power as they did when they were kids, the twins are able to see their mother's room for the first time in a while. Their mother was an artist and also very into the fantasy world she and her children created called the Book of Goblins, which the twins find in their own room. The player can immediately read the entirety of their Book of Goblins, which took me a while, but I did do, and it's a neat way of showing some foreshadowing of the story to come without being a dragging necessity for the player to have to consume all of. It also turns out that their mother was kind of like a way nicer version of Jigsaw if he just created fun puzzles all around the house for his twins to solve and get prizes from, based exclusively on the Book of Goblins lore. After solving their first mom puzzle, and isn't everyone just their own complex web of puzzles anyway, the twins discover that their mom has 2 pieces of conflicting information in her room. One is a progressive book about raising a transgender child, and the other a pamphlet advertising a Christian conversion therapy camp. Tyler is especially startled by this, already realizing that perhaps he had misinterpreted his mother's actions that night, while Allison is already worried about where this rabbit hole might lead them. They decide to find more information and head into town, tracking down one of Mary Ann's former best friends, Tessa. At the town's general store, run by Tessa and her husband Tom, we are first introduced to Michael, Allison's best friend. Michael alerts us to Allison's potential plan, that the 2 of them want to move to Juneau and rent an apartment together. Michael wants to become a professional chef, and Allison wants to finally be free of Delos Crossing and start somewhere new. Tyler is also very much invited to join them. Talking to Tom, the players see that he is weird and boring, but he is also another character for the player to experience the coming out simulator this game often takes, but in a necessary way. Although Allison has always been on Tyler's side, telling people he is her brother and happily adapting to his chosen name, the very small town only knows Tyler to be A, the apparent killer of his mom, and B, Allison's twin sister. While some characters Tyler meets for the first time will react in an unsurprisingly transphobic way, you as the player have the option a few times to react in a more patient and education-minded way, or to react by refusing to engage with it and feeling it is not your burden to educate anyone. Both are appreciated, and both are certainly valid. It is all up to the player. Tom is one of many who will act a bit weirded out, but then just kind of get used to it. The game will never dead name Tyler, however, and though Tyler must face many photos of himself as a child, I think it can be read as Tyler's deeper acceptance of himself. It might be bizarre to face these photos, but they are still him, and he knows who he is and always has been. It's also kind of interesting because as Tyler is more visibly queer due to his physical changes, queer characters will subtly come out to him as he meets them, largely because they admire him and his personality makes them feel safe to do so. It's neat, and I find it to be a great portrayal. Michael, who I did not know was a romance option, but who I flirted with immediately and accidentally made Allison a third wheel mere days after meeting him, will come out to Tyler quickly whether or not the 2 want to get together or to remain friends. No matter what, Michael tells Tyler how important activism has been for him and that in Juneau he has a queer community and a found family, and he would love for Tyler to be able to experience that if he wants to. How excellent! Michael is a great character, and we shared a beautiful romance while ice fishing, an activity I imagined before to be something outrageously unromantic, but this game changed my mind. Progress. Love is love. In the general store, the twins begin to try and scrounge up a solid case with which to take to Tessa, who herself seems reticent to speak about Mary Ann. We also begin to notice that Tyler and Allison can see some memories differently, as memory is subjective. Not to mention, the way you remember it will be altered throughout time and where you are emotionally when remembering it. It really adds a great level of dimension to the story, and the player can choose which memory and the feeling brought with it better represents the shape they feel the story is taking or should take. Based on the information you may or may not have gathered, Tessa says that the conversion therapy pamphlet was her idea as a devout Christian and kind of just goes #MyBad about it, which is kind of a go-to Christian response, honestly. The progressive book then was Mary Ann's, and the twins begin to realize she knew much more than she ever said, and that during her last days, something bad was happening. As they continue to dig, meeting up with Eddie at the police station and later breaking into said police station, they realize there are many things which they haven't been told. We are also shown that Allison was the one to stab Mary Ann, who she believed to be ready to shoot at Tyler, and that Mary Ann fell into the lake as a result. Tyler was in fact the one to take the blame and lie to the police. He went to jail for Allison, and Allison has felt that burden on top of having stabbed her mother since the incident. While they snoop, the twins discover that Tessa called child services on Mary Ann, that she actually died of drowning and not stabbing, and that Eddie was the one who broke protocol to inform Mary Ann that her children were going to be taken by the state. Eddie himself confirms this, and the player is given more major choices about how the twins' relationship is to be tested. The subject too of their father is brought up. When they return to their house, a hooded figure is attempting to set fire to their barn, which is remarkably silly and played out in a very awkward way. They discovered that he was trying to destroy evidence of some letters sent by former suitors of Mary Ann. And there are some leaps of logic, but the twins determine that the hooded figure must have been their father, as one does. Tyler tries to push Allison to remember the hooded figure when he appeared too in their childhood, but it is much too close to the scene of the crime and it pushes Allison too far. The following morning, Allison is hiding out from Tyler at her house. She is starting to suffer majorly from post-traumatic stress, and her powers are manifesting into horrible visions which blame her and reflect the hatred she feels for herself. We learn that she's pretty much been white-knuckling her deteriorating mental health for years, and she finds encouragement from loved ones, including Eddie and Michael, to seek professional help. I think this part is very important too, as Allison states quite truthfully that not only is there a level of stigma, but it's always been too expensive and physically too far to find a therapist. That's a huge problem for many rural communities. Michael, being the excellent friend he is, says that he would rather Allison use the money from selling her house to afford professional help, instead of using it to move in with him in Juneau, and particularly that she would neither be letting him down nor disappointing him. Also, just an excellent demonstration of the American healthcare system. You can pick one thing and only one, naughty children. Either leave the town where you experience crushing trauma and intense PTSD, or be able to afford a therapist. Choose wisely. Allison interacts with several characters at the police station and at the general store too, who seem determined that she is acting wrong and should revert to her normally happy self. They will allude to their belief that Tyler is the one influencing her negatively because they believe he is a criminal, for one, and it can certainly be inferred that their visible conservative belief systems inform their subtle or unsubtle transphobia, that to them, Tyler is living a lifestyle choice, and that choice is much too loud, and of course reflects some level of deviancy, a word very often associated with queerness in the conservative dialect of all collective human experience forced into a few tiny little boxes. Tyler, who we can understand and who himself discusses that he has had access to professional help and been given substantial time to come to terms with his past and who he is, can certainly be accused of pushing Allison, someone who very much was not ready for this flood of new information. She may also not see it as healing the way that Tyler does, because they are, of course, different people. But Tyler is able to recognize this and apologizes to Allison for not considering her enough. On the flip side, though, I think that when played a certain way, this apology is not quite as effective, and perhaps Allison still does not feel very heard by Tyler. She may even feel that Tyler's decision to take the blame was just that, his decision, and another burden of guilt Allison has had to suffer from. Whatever relationship strength or dysfunction the twins are experiencing at this point, however, Allison has already gone to visit with Sam, a character we've met a few times who is very much in love with Marianne, and who for a moment the twins believed might be their father. Sam reveals that in the barn on the twins' property, he had built a loft at the very top, accessible bizarrely by a hidden Nancy Drew-type lever, which the twins discover. Together they ascend to the loft, and initially it seemed like it might be that whole ending sequence from Hereditary, but fortunately it was not. The loft contains the world of the Book of Goblins, which Marianne has brought to life in the form of beautiful murals/puzzles. Each mural represents a part of her life, which she has fictionalized into the goblins' world. And the characters are, as we have already been learning throughout the game, based on people in their lives. The princess is, of course, Marianne, and the twins continue these mom puzzles to discover more about her life. She left behind a wealthy, albeit abusive life back in California, pursuing her passion for her art and her desire for freedom. Eventually, she found her way to Delos Crossing. Tragically, she had lost her first baby, but when her twins, her goblins, were born, she was happy again to raise them among her group of friends. Happiness, though, is of course not a state achieved permanently like in a fairy tale, and tragedy in life will always still happen. Mental health can deteriorate, depression can become all-consuming, and grief itself is cyclical and circular. The twins realized that Marianne was falling apart, isolating herself and indeed putting her children at risk in doing so. Tessa calling child services on their family, we find, was largely an act of revenge, because it was her husband Tom who fathered the twins. Unfortunately, though, Tessa had highlighted some compelling evidence against Marianne. Though she made it expressly clear in a letter she wrote to her children that she loved them and understood that Tyler was her son, the case of whether Marianne was emotionally equipped to raise them is complicated, and the game doesn't shy away from it. Learning that the state intended to take them from her seems to be what really broke her. The twins confirm these details with Tom, who turns out to be a real nasty little guy, and he presents what he saw that day, because he was there too, basically just letting Marianne drown as he watched from the shadows. In his memory, Marianne had lowered her gun and was trying to tell Tyler that she wasn't about to hurt him. This is kind of the peak unreliable narrator atonement-style choice the player has to make. No one is expressly telling the one truth, and on all sides, mistakes, misremembering, and bias informed exactly what they saw that night. By choosing which they feel is the right story, the player makes it the truth. We are the third party and judge to the information presented. The player may choose either Tom's version, that Mary Ann was never violent, or the twins' version, that Mary Ann was about to shoot during a psychotic break. If the player decides on Tom, the twins will come to terms with the fact that it was just a mistake, a terrible, tragic one, but one which they cannot change, and one that they have to move on from. In the epilogue, they have sold the house, and Tyler walks us through its empty hallways. Michael and Allison have moved to Juneau, where Allison is indulging in new hobbies and going to therapy, and Tyler is soon to join them. If Michael and Tyler started a relationship, you will see that this is continuing happily. Depending on the bond you build with Allison as well, the pictures of your adventures together in Juneau will reflect how well or distance you are doing. It will also determine whether the twins continue to use their voice, representing the closeness they continue to want, or that they would prefer to distance themselves emotionally. I believe this ending can also be achieved if Allison tells Eddie the truth about having stabbed Mary Ann. If the player decides to choose the twins' version of events, centered around Mary Ann's violence, they'll rationalize it as a kind of murder-suicide scenario, and that Allison's actions were heroic, saving both herself and Tyler. I believe in most cases this gives the epilogue that in order to find peace and heal on her own terms, Allison chooses to keep the house, remodeling it to suit her creative lifestyle and enabling it to live beyond its tragic past and become a new place of refuge. Tyler will not be there, however, as he has moved past Delos Crossing and will find his future elsewhere. Depending on the relationship again, as Allison moves through the house, it will either show that the twins have a strong bond despite their physical distance, or that things are strained, and it will, in my opinion, add a kind of loneliness to Allison's quiet lifestyle. I discovered that very few people chose Tom's version of events, and that there was a lot of debate about Allison's homebody ending. Personally, I both chose Tom's version and preferred the ending that came with it. Playing through the game, I believed that the story suggested a much more loving version of Mary Ann, and its emphasis on the metaphysics of memory, especially of those in childhood compared to those in adulthood, only added weight to processing the trauma of the tragedy and misunderstanding it severely through the eyes of a child. Mistakes are an enormous part of life, no matter their severity, and we all have to process them. Yet personally, I'm also of the mindset that finding chosen family or a supportive community, as well as leaving behind the places you have simply outgrown to experience change in new environments, is a good and healthy practice. And yet, there is also a great power in reclaiming a space to become your own, and healing on your own terms through peace and quiet. I don't believe the game favors either ending, and in fact, each one holds pretty equally its own merit. It's simply how the player feels and what speaks to them. The game might seem more sad or lonely that the twins are distanced if the player made those choices, but again, that is also a part of life. That's something which is natural, and there doesn't have to be inherent sadness about it. So I'm not sure if I made this clear, but this game gave me quite a lot to think about. Reading some reviews, it generally received high praise, although some accused it of straight up being boring. Honestly, I can't fault them for that either. These heavy atmospheric walking simulators can be a bit much for a lot of players, and I must admit that I generally find myself more drawn to objectively boring media with a lot of talking or long shots of nothing. As far as gameplay, there really isn't much apart from look at thing and think about it, or click what to say to other person. There are several jigsaw mom puzzles which were pretty fun to solve, although just contextually insane and silly when you step back from them. There was also one very frustrating puzzle which involved math. I shudder even to state the word. And there was also a panic attack minigame, which was both disturbing and hard to figure out. But that really is it on the hardcore gameplay. Again, that's like fine to me, and I prefer it like that for this genre, but I get it. Overall, I enjoyed the voice acting, but like all Don't Nod games, the script can get a bit awkward or cringy, and sometimes the voice actors just kinda had to work with that. The soundscapes, however, are fabulous as always. Don't Nod has excellent sound design on top of beautiful, detailed mini environments. Surprisingly though, the soundtrack was a bit lacking, because usually they are absolute bangers. I will say that at the beginning of episode 2, there is a pretty good music moment with a really sweet sequence of the twins running through the house as adults and kids, and I was like, yes, ultimate Don't Nod moment. The graphics, well, I don't really have much to say. They look good to me. Normally, Don't Nod has some trouble with syncing mouths because of the French to English thing, and sure, I noticed a few times in this game, on top of some occasionally awkward animations, but the truth is, I don't really care. I didn't really care about graphics at all, actually. I never have. If they're stylized, I usually think that adds to a game's design. And if they're Ultra 4K Max or whatever, I'm like, great. There is one particular time I've had a caring about graphics moment, and that is in the Life is Strange 1 remaster. A game so catastrophically bad, I exiled it from my PlayStation and try never to dwell upon it unless I want to be consumed by rage. The pacing of this game suffers from being crammed, sometimes poorly, into 3 episodes as opposed to the normal Don't Nod 5, where each episode is often contained in one distinct, memorable start-to-finish story, while successfully playing a role in moving the overall plot forwards. While it seems that some sequences might go on too long, there is also a wonder at why there are not a broader range of them, why the town seems so small, though it is small, and where the other people might be hiding in it. None of Don't Nod's worlds have ever seemed so confined as they do in Tell Me Why, and I began to wonder if it was simply a lack of time for development, COVID-related development issues, what had to be cut from the script, where they might have run out of resources, or if this was all intentional. Honestly, maybe it was. Perhaps it was supposed to add to the tight, confined feeling which the twins are experiencing. Yet still, it often feels like the game is missing parts of itself, or that when it had to be cut down or edited, certain sequences were okay to be put maybe out of order in a way which seemed to still fit the overall story, and which do, but sort of uncomfortably. Mostly, I like this game a lot. I enjoyed playing it, thinking about it, writing about it, and I think the characters and story are nuanced, very human, and worth any number of replays or revisits. I think Tell Me Why, like other Don't Nod games, relies much too heavily on the hook of true crime, and sometimes it feels like Don't Nod developers are collectively the kind of person who will recommend a true crime podcast to you each time you hang out, and you'll always be like, okay. But they've proven that that's not all they're capable of before, and I have hope for their future projects to move past that appeal, yet combine their particular signature into refreshing, story-driven narrative games. I feel that their studio always has important discussions and that they craft their characters with respect and earnestness. There's a moment in like episode 2 or something where Tyler tells Allison somewhat nonchalantly how much he's looking forward to top surgery so he doesn't have to wear a binder anymore. This is like sandwiched between the start of their crazy metaphysical memory journey and when they decide to break into a literal police station. It's such a benign statement comparatively. It's so normal. This is just an aspect particular to Tyler's life, his very human life. It felt very affirming that even in these wild video game worlds in AAA titles, we are allowed to just exist. There is a place for us in these stories, and our normal everyday experiences are just as important as everyone else's. They make us who we are, and to see them given such deference on par with everything else presented in this story is incredibly meaningful.
So she was cool with who I was?
She was more than that. She loved you.
Anyway, happy Pride, everybody. Go out there and do some cool shit.